Okay, so this time we're looking at political action. So this is the second talk on two on politics. So the previous one, we were looking at um, political ideologies and political views. But this time we're focusing more on, well, what does it mean to be involved in politics and how can that be compatible with middle way practice? Because obviously it raises a lot of dilemmas and difficulties, and people have lots of different responses to that. So some people find politics very difficult and want nothing to do with it. Other people want to throw themselves into it because they feel this huge responsibility for the world. So how do we deal with all that? Well, first I want to point out that political action is a whole spectrum of things, really. So it might involve very little occasional action. So voting is an obvious starting point, isn't it? Yeah, you just do that once every few years, probably. It doesn't require a lot of effort. Then there are things like discussing politics, taking some interest in it, reading some stuff on it. And then we can gradually ramp up to things like party involvement or campaigning group involvement, actively being involved in campaigns of some kind. And finally, at the top of the spectrum, if you like, we've got, well, what in Britain we will call standing for office, but in America they call running for office. Interesting, different language there, I think. But yeah, so actually attempting to take major responsibility for political decisions. So what I just wanted to point out there is, of course, that there's a spectrum, so there's different points you could reach on that spectrum, and you could find your own point on it. It's not just a question of just doing politics as a whole or not doing politics at all. We all find our different ways of doing it. So obviously, if you talk to people, perhaps people who meditate or people who are involved maybe in the arts or other kinds of integrative practices, you may often find some of them at least don't like politics or have a reaction to it, or they want to be apolitical. And that seems to me to often be, well, it has dangers, because by trying to be apolitical, you can't actually succeed, in the sense that your lack of activity also has an effect. I mean, the sort of traditional way of putting that was, people who believed themselves to be apolitical were conservative, at least with a small c, perhaps with a large c, because that was the kind of default position. If you didn't take a position, then that might mean that you were put in a default. It's a bit like in Britain being Church of England because you do nothing else. But I think that's probably that's out of date now, really, because conservatism with a big C has moved on so much, or changed its nature so much. But certainly there's still a danger of avoiding responsibility in some way, or avoiding facing up to the effects your actions do have, even if you think you're avoiding politics. But also, I think if one does avoid politics without thinking about it in connection with everything else, there are some dangers in that as well. If you don't think about it thoughtfully as part of an overall vision of your path, then it can end up disjointed, really, or it can end up with some major, perhaps glaring clashes with other aspects of your life. And I just read an article today, actually, about the way in which the QAnon conspiracy theories seem to be spreading, particularly in the yoga community. So that's quite it's something I shared on Facebook, on the Middle Way discussion page on Facebook. So it's interesting, I think, that people who do integrative practices, that's not necessarily an inoculation against conspiracy theories. For example, if you're not connecting one form of integrative practice with another, if you're not seeing it as part of a wider process. And so I think that's one of the major things that we need to do in relation to middle way practices, connect things together and encourage people to see yoga, for example, as connected to critical thinking. But then, of course, yeah, there's just the sense of responsibility, isn't there? And especially given the enormous issues that face the planet and our societies, that we may just feel that we can't avoid politics for that reason. And if we do, then it's liable to leave a vacuum as well, because really politics needs relatively integrated people. So if you're trying to practice, you're going to become relatively integrated, at least. And if you don't get involved in politics, then you're leaving the field open, you're leaving a vacuum, if you like, for more insecure people who are just motivated by power, perhaps, to do so. So that's something else worth taking into account, I think. We're part of a bigger picture of some people needing to do it, as it were. But of course, you may immediately also be struck by the dangers if you get involved in politics in any way. Basically, the danger of being swallowed up by polarized groupthink. And again, you can readily see that happening in all sorts of places. By people maybe who join a political party with really high-minded intentions, but end up really being so partisan in that party that they're really losing touch with wider issues or perhaps their original motivations. So I think it's important for that reason to approach politics as an aspect of integrative practice and to keep connecting it with that. So that means that it needs to be based on and connecting with other integrative practices. For example, as I keep saying, meditation, the arts, and critical thinking. I mean, there have been some politicians who have done these sorts of things, and they've not always been perfect politicians, of course, but I think it's added a dimension to them as human beings which have made a difference. A few famous examples. I mean, Barack Obama, for example, I think is quite capable of quite a lot of critical thinking and made that clear in some of his interviews and discussions. And then we've had some major politicians in Britain who were closely involved in the arts, of which perhaps Ted Heath is the most famous example. Anyway, so yeah, perhaps the major question for us as individuals is not so much should we be involved as how far should I as an individual be involved. So we've got a spectrum of degrees of involvement. And at the bottom of that spectrum, really, so just voting, for example, the stakes are very low. So I can't see much excuse really for not voting, especially given how easy it is now to do it by post or whatever. But as we go up the spectrum, then potential difficulties arise, and particularly the dangers from stress, the dangers of getting sucked into polarization, the dangers of your wider practice failing because of of your political involvement. So the dangers of stress I've talked about recently on the retreat about living with uncertainty, and basically how stress can make us make appalling judgments, and certainly takes us away from the middle way and into absolutized kinds of judgment, which in political terms are often extreme or at least poorly thought out judgments. So yeah, obviously we have different, as individuals, we have different degrees of ability to cope with stress. So part of the assessment of whether one gets involved in politics or how far does depend on that. Can you, for example, deal with other people attacking you personally? Because they're going to, really, at some point, if you're involved in politics to any extent. Even if you comment on Twitter or something in a political way, then you're liable to get personal attacks. So you need to really have enough grounding to be able to cope with that. And then there's, if people do get into political office, I'd be under no illusion that it involves a lot of work, long hours, and you have to sacrifice other things really in order to make that work. So I quite often have a lot of admiration for the ways in which politicians are prepared to make those sacrifices. And another consideration really is how well your own character or temperament is adapted to, and how far you can make a difference as an individual to political life. And so my personal take on that is, I'm not so much worried about the stress side of it, but I have come to the conclusion that I wouldn't be much shaked as a politician personally. So I'm decided to stick to more intellectual type of commentary or philosophical involvement in politics rather than more direct campaigning or standing for office. But nevertheless, individually, I remained very interested in politics, and also I used to teach it at A level. So maybe some questions to ask yourself if you're thinking about how to find your level in political involvement. So are you taking yourself into account? So it's very easy to have this sort of idealized view of what must be done in capital letters because the world is so bad, but you won't be able to change that in any meaningful way or helpful way unless you are yourself in a position to do so. So if you don't take yourself into account, then the whole thing won't work. Then on the other side, are you taking the wider situation into account? So it's quite possible just to focus on your own practice, maybe in too narrow a way, and not take into account the way in which you're constantly affected and interacting with wider conditions in our society, including political conditions. Are you taking responsibility? So I think responsibility is one of those major elements in political involvement. It's something I talked about earlier in the first talk on ethics. So I see responsibility as being something we feel rather than something that's just imposed on us, and it's basically an ethical experience, the experience of responsibility, which has a fairly natural expression through political action, I think. Are you setting up the conditions to make politics a practice rather than just a pursuit of success, for example? And are you able to make a difference? So another aspect of this, obviously, how you get involved in politics does make a difference. And this relates more to the previous talk about ideologies and so on. But if you put all your time into an idealistic fringe group that has very little chance of success, for example, well, maybe that's not the best way to make a difference. But the same can apply to just being sucked into a conventional mainstream party, where the ways you could make a difference to it then become subsumed into the whole thing as it is. So no easy decisions there. But politics is always the art of the possible. So joining a party or joining a group does involve trust, as well as ability to work with the flaws of that group, which they're going to be. So we can ask ourselves things like, how far is that group integrated? So there's a whole other discussion we could have there actually about the integration of groups and the integration of parties and governments and so on. So how far are they actually working together rather than subjected to constant conflict? And either obvious conflict or authoritarianism, which is trying to cover it up, could be indications of problems in a group. Are you able to interpret the ideology of that group in an integrative way? So obviously there will be compromises. You are most unlikely to completely agree with everything the leadership of the group says, for example, but there's obviously a degree of compromise involved there. And of course, we're subject to surrounding political and social systems which limit what difference we can make. So things like the electoral system, for example, is an obvious one. Makes it much more likely that involvement in a minor party, like the Green Party still is, unfortunately, is much less likely to be politically successful. But there may be other ways that minor parties have some impact. And constitutional limitations, the cultural landscape, the media conditions, and the education of citizens, all of those have a big impact on the political culture and affect how much, if at all, we're able to make a difference. So I guess that's one area where I've been involved is educating students about politics, and that's something I found very satisfying, something I was able to do. Okay, so I'm going to round this off now, but just to point out, actually, in relation to this topic, that I have done a much longer talk, which is exactly really about this same topic, and that talk is on YouTube, and it's called Depolarizing Politics 2, Activists or Quietists. So it's really focused on the dilemma between being active politically or being quietistic. So that's going to be it's about 3 times as long as this talk. So it goes into a lot more detail of the issues if you're interested. Okay, but what I've just said really is more of like a headline summary of some of the things I said in that longer talk. So I'm going to stop there for now and open up to immediate responses or questions. I know some of you have been involved in politics in various ways, so by all means say something about your own conclusions on this topic. It would be interesting. For example, Barry or Julian, do you want to come in there?
I think my silence on this is it's really down to the fact that I've gone from one extreme of kind of quite active involvement to doing nothing at all. So I've been very quietistic over the last year. So I knew I was going to find it challenging listening to this tonight. Because I know I definitely am at that end of the spectrum at the moment. It all got a bit overwhelming, I think, and just pull back from it.
So do you think is that a danger that we're likely to run into of throwing ourselves into it and then finding it too much and then coming back again?
I think it's very common, yeah, and I think, and obviously you alluded to that in your talk, didn't you? That it can be quite a difficult place to inhabit. Even within a group that you actually, you're fundamentally, you're basically aligned with. Even within that context, like you said, you're not going to agree with everything that the person, the leadership thinks. Never mind, the other people who aren't in leadership positions. So it requires quite a lot of self-confidence and grounding, I think, to step up to the plate and actually make things happen.
Mm.
Yeah.
Similar experience for me, actually. I was very involved with the environmental movement, specifically XR, to the point that I got a criminal record for willful obstruction of the highway in the last big event in London. Was it 2019? But I've taken a step back. I think largely because of COVID, though. I mean, it's made it quite difficult to actually. I mean, you can get online with Zoom, but I think I'm a bit zoomed out, and I have to choose my Zoom activities carefully, not to just get overloaded. So, but it's something I hope to maybe not XR, but certainly the Green Party, I hope to get involved in again when we see some clear water through our present in our present situation.
Do you think, this is a general question, do you think that one can actually make political action part of practice? There's certainly some people who would resist that, I think. Does it make sense in relation to your experience?
I think so. I think it's I'm also a member of a philosophy group, and we were studying Aristotle, and Aristotle specifically thought politics was about practicing to be a good citizen, and and the whole activity of debating subjects and bringing, a critical awareness to the various issues that a society faces is integrative, as long as you, in many ways, as long as you mainly see it as a practice rather than maybe a more baser desire, such as just a pursuit of power or privilege or or recognition or whatever.
I often, what you said about being grounded, I look at some of the action and contemplation groups. Thomas Merton was one. Richard Raw is very much go hand in hand, but it's that amazing capacity to be grounded, non-reactive. I know I couldn't do it. I would be poked and provoked too much, I think.
So how do you think how do those figures recommend that we stay grounded?
Yeah, through practice. I think it's all about the practice and about seeing God in all and all in God, and not getting trapped by the power struggles. But, when you feel passionate about something, it's so easy to be triggered. And I see a lot of politicians that are like that are not polarized. They just get trampled on at some level. And so someone like Thomas Merton made a very big impact through his writings. So that's how I think he got engaged. And I think Richard Raw's the same. And there are a lot of people that have done that. And I deeply admire them.
And as I think I mentioned, there certainly have been some politicians who, to me, did seem to have something of a practice, both in the UK and the US to some extent. I mean, they're less obvious at the moment, I think, but perhaps in relatively recent past. There was a whole lot of sort of more intellectual practitioners in the Labour Party, for example, wasn't there? There was people like Dennis Healy, was it Roy Hattersley, people like that, who had a lot of heft to them, a lot of sort of balancing sort of awareness, I think. Even though I'm not suggesting they're perfect at all, but I wonder why we've lost that sort of caliber of politician. Don't tell it so much. All of those politicians had serious weaknesses as well, but obviously ways that you could criticize their policies and so on. But the idea that, well, to some degree, there was a practice going on. You could perhaps imagine that because there were other sides of their life which gave a bit more context to their political life, and perhaps gave them a perspective on that political life that perhaps wouldn't be the case otherwise. Whereas it's harder to say. So somebody as utterly single-minded as Margaret Thatcher, for example, I never felt that she did have that kind of perspective. Politics wasn't a practice for her; it was a pursuit of power for certain ideological ends. anyway, so maybe those sorts of illustrations can help to well, give that a bit more grounding, maybe, to whether or not you're familiar with those historical examples. But, okay, perhaps we can stop there in terms of the initial discussion. Okay, so any questions or thoughts that have come up in your groups that you'd like to share in the wider plenary?
We talked a bit, because two of us are Quakers, and there were we talked quite a bit about the resilience of a group, of belonging to a larger group, so that you're not mashed up in politics, so that you're just one of many and being deeply supported, so you can come and go and come and go on the front line of the battle.
That's interesting. Yeah. So is that how you said that started with the Quakers? So is that how the Quakers functions for you?
Yeah, Keith, help me out.
Yeah, it was more about, the power of community and the sort of 300, 400-year-old principles that are still in place, which you can align yourself to. And there's spiritual practice right at the heart of it, not dissimilar to many other meditative or contemplative practices. And yet, you can go into there for, regeneration, rejuvenation. You can find a truth in all of that. And that can help you sort of not become too passionate, but certainly compassionately detached. And then with that, exercise your rights to vote, for non-violent direct action, etc. And that can have impact, significant impact. And then you can not retreat as such, but renew yourself through reconnecting with the community. That was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some involvements with the Quakers at various points, and certainly admired the way that they've managed to integrate political approaches, I suppose, with a spirituality, by making it a very open spirituality. But at the same time, they do have some ideological kind of sticking points, and I found their pacifism quite difficult. Well, I couldn't just sign up to that, put it that way. Yeah, so there's a bit of a model there. I mean, there's some ways in which, thinking of having a sort of social grounding or touching point. I hope the Middle Way Society maybe in future could act in that sort of way. That's one of my visions for it anyway, that people could be involved in all sorts of other groups, whether they're political or religious, or whatever. But the Middle Way Society could provide a source of support for doing that in a middle way fashion, for example, not getting sucked into absolutist sort of ways of thinking within that tradition.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very interesting.
Any other thoughts?
We were thinking quite laterally around politics and theatre and education, or politics as theatre, in fact, and questioning why some people who seem to have this power or gift for using media to project themselves, who possibly shouldn't deserve power, Trump and Farage would be examples that come to mind, and why other people who have very good ideas, sometimes pin sharp for it, that I've been reading about, have no presence at all in terms of projecting themselves through media. So the problem is, and I made a point at the end that young people have to learn to spot when they are being manipulated or just understand rhetoric and how it works with people who are putting across certain views, that they're making you buy a world that is a reality, but it's not a reality that everyone needs, and we can't have too many different realities. And I think this is a problem on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah,
right now.
Critical thinking comes in, isn't it? It's the,
yeah.
which is the theme of my talk on the recent retreat, which is up on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it, on critical thinking in uncertain times. So there I do go through some of the sort of key critical thinking skills that might be most important in uncertain times, as it were, in stressful, politically fraught times.
Yeah, we also discussed how difficult it is to have a middle way position and yet have a strong political voice, especially with the current media and social media theater, where the stronger voices and the simpler arguments are often more appealing or get more popularity.
So did you find any ways forward with that difficulty?
Sorry, find a way forward.
I was asking Mark particularly, did you find any ways forward with that difficulty?
Well, we talked about how it's a problem in the political systems in the UK and the US, but also the heritage, of people having different value systems and then certain issues taking such priority that, like, abortion and Trump, that people overlook all sorts of other inconsistencies because they might feel so strongly about one issue. And how Trump was able to perform for very different kinds of people and somehow unite them, even though he wasn't a good example of what they valued morally, or I didn't talk about this in our session, but I've heard discussion in the news media about why evangelical Christians supported Trump, and some of them are now questioning that. But there's even a logic of, well, if God is actually the director of this theater in the sky, then maybe he picks someone who seems otherwise unworthy, and we should support him even though he seems so flawed, because that shows how God is the one actually behind it all. So there's a way of rationalizing a lot of inconsistencies when a leader is able to play to different groups. And the term fascism came up because Trump was not ideologically consistent, but he was able to stir people's melodramatic good versus evil and threat of a villain emotions, and also suspicion of government. So the very governmental agencies that Biden is trying to restore now in order to help people desperately in need were what many of Trump's followers were so suspicious of, and then angry at, and showed their destructive rage in storming the Capitol, because it was, in a way, electing someone who would just be as destructive in dismantling government rather than using it to help people. So there's a big divide here, between those who want government to work better to help people and those who just are so suspicious of it that they want it dismantled. And it's difficult to find a middle way as we were discussing, when we look at these kind of complexities.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I was trying to do, particularly in this session, is to start with us and think about how do we relate to those kinds of situations.
We did talk about how each of us personally has some connection to these, and it was interesting, since I'm from the States, and I appreciated the comparisons with the UK.
I suppose one of the things I mentioned in relation to practice in the initial discussion was some UK politicians in the past showing some signs of having perspective on what they were doing, which seemed to come from a wider practice. And I think that's not foreign to the US culture either. I think I mentioned that about Obama anyway, just as someone who seems to have that perspective. Not by any means, I wouldn't say he's a middle way practitioner or anything, but he seems to be somebody, let's say, with a wide degree of awareness. Would you agree? So is that kind of the model that one can think about to, well, what would it take to try and start changing polarization in the US?
Obama as a model?
Well, as a person or as a model of practice, shall we say?
Yeah, actually, I think it was Julian maybe who asked, what have I seen that gave insight as to these problems? And I mentioned Michael Moore's documentary, Fahrenheit 11/9, which I recently watched. And that actually criticizes Obama for going to Flint, Michigan while he was president and, theatrically drinking a glass of water to show the mostly Black audience, lower class people had suffered from the poisoning of their tap water. It was okay as a Black man, the president drinking the water, so you can too. And Moore's film is very critical of him, but of course even more so of Trump, but how the leaders get kind of caught up in supporting one another and not really seeing or helping the people who have elected them.
Yeah, so there's the depth of the corrupting effects of powers and the maybe party pressures and so on. And also, I'm very aware when the topic of Obama comes up that his drone warfare and things like that tend to get mentioned.
Yeah, and he was very harsh, at the border as well. So I think, it's the complexities and the pressures of office can shape people. Even though I did support him and see him as a great potential leader, but of course he came in with not much experience as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully Biden has much more experience and can be wary of those kind of reshapings.
But there's a general point there. I think that political leaders always have flaws, quite major flaws, and we're going to have to put up with that, whoever it is. And if we did it ourselves, I think it's most unlikely that we do it any better in most cases. Certainly I wouldn't. So I think the principle of charity is very applicable, I think, to how it doesn't mean that we let politicians off the hook in the broader sense, but whilst remaining aware of the ways they could improve what they do, we also need to be aware of the ways in which the different pressures that work on them, to limit what they can achieve, and that politics is all about compromise, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we just got time for one final point. If anyone else wants to come up with come in there. How about Anna? How does this look from an Australian perspective?
Yeah, very interesting. I brought up in our group where in Australia it's compulsory to vote. We have to vote or we get fined. So I'm interested in the difference that makes too. That my husband's American, so he's not that sure that it's such a good idea. But anyway, that's another point that was probably too late to discuss. But that kind of pressure on people to take an interest. Yeah.
Right. But maybe up to a certain point. I mean, it's not exactly a huge imposition, is it, to make people vote?
Yeah, exactly. And whether that's good news or the bad news, Mark kind of points out that it means people who don't care about politics vote. So does that stack things? But I have many friends in the States who don't vote, and it just horrifies me. I don't know anyone here who would choose to not vote. So yeah, that brings in a different dynamic.
Yeah, maybe it helps to produce more of a sense of responsibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, we better wind up there. I will stop